Our final paper is by Sandra Batten from the Bank of England, talking about climate change, the macroeconomic impact and implications for monetary policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here at such an interesting conference. This is a joint paper with two colleagues of the Bank of England, Rhiannon Saubat and Misa Tanaka, and therefore I need to stress that these are only our views and do not represent the views of our employer or its the three policy committees of the Bank of England. When we started our project looking at the implication of climate change for central banks' objectives, it felt quite a lonely place. And that's why it's such a great thing that the Fed has organized this conference. There have been other speeches on the climate change and monetary policy, for example, by policymakers at the Bank of Canada, ECB, and the Australian Central Bank. Sometimes it's difficult to talk about climate change and monetary policy. Such a short time horizon doesn't seem to be affected by climate change issues which are longer term. But what we're trying in this paper, we're trying to raise all the issues that might arise, in particular impact on inflation and on potential growth, and also spillovers between macroeconomic and financial stability issues that affect central banks. So we really have a helicopter view of the issues that might affect monetary policy. So I'll start with a risk framework and then talk about the transmission channels and the implication for monetary policy, talk a little bit about the modeling issues, and then feedbacks from financial stability. So climate risks, physical and transition risk have been discussed extensively. Physical risk arise. There's two aspects of physical risks. There's a gradual global warming, so as slow-moving increases in temperatures and associated physical changes such as rainfall and rising sea levels. And at the same time, increasing frequency, severity, and correlation of certain types of extreme weather events. And scientists are fairly confident that the gradual global warming is causing this increased severity and frequency of these climate events. So there's a whole new area of science called event attribution. For example, the American Meteorological Society has assessed that for example, the 2017 heat waves in Southern Europe were made 3 times more likely from climate change compared to 1950s. Transition risks are those associated with transition to a low-carbon economy, arise predominantly from climate policy, agent expectations, and technology. And the two types of risk are not unrelated. There's no escaping from the risks. In a scenario where climate change is unmitigated, we will face increasing physical risks. But in a scenario where there is mitigation, then the transition risks will be more prevalent. So either way, these risks are important for the economy. So as a summary, you can think of the extreme climate event as unanticipated shocks, and they can affect both demand and supply, and can materialize in the short to medium run. Global warming, you can think of affecting more the supply side, the potential growth, and being more of a medium to long run phenomenon. Transition risks, again, can be thought as shocks or effects to economic growth. They can materialize quite suddenly, even in the short run. So the climate shocks can affect both demand and supply. So, and all components of aggregate demand, so investment, uncertainty due to the damage caused by climate events, consumption. So the increased risk of flooding or fires affect property, and that could have wealth effect to affect consumption. And there is quite an extensive literature already of the impact of natural disasters on trade. On the supply side, destruction to physical capital, but also infrastructure capital. So there is quite a striking example of a couple of years ago of the drought in Germany that caused the River Rhine and other rivers to have a very low level, which affected transportation in a significant way and impacted manufacturing output and GDP. Other inputs, energy. So after Fukushima, for example, the energy mix of Japan changed dramatically, which led to huge increases in energy prices for households. So more, for example, another example is when a drought in 2010 affected agricultural product and Russia banned the export of grains that could have potentially led to increases in prices of grains and therefore fed into inflation across the world. So this might be tentative evidence. There are other more recent papers that have more rigorous studies of and will find the impact of climate change on inflation. There is also a growing literature on the impact of natural disasters on GDP, which empirically seems to agree that in the short term there is a negative effect on GDP. There's much less agreement on further out, and this is important for the central bank because it's important to understand the balance of demand and supply and its impact on inflation. So there are recent examples of when monetary policy had to react to climate disaster. For example, in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, the Federal Reserve judged that any impacts were temporary, so they didn't change the policy stance. The Bank of Japan instead increased their asset purchase program in the aftermath of the Great East Japan earthquakes. And similarly, the Thailand Central Bank decreased interest rate following extensive flooding. So to summarize, there are implications for physical risk for monetary policy. So effect on inflation, potential increase in volatility of inflation, but also longer-term effect on potential supply. So damage to physical and infrastructure capital. Also the need to replace physical capital more often due to global warming. The higher depreciation of physical capital. We've seen, for example, this morning, the impact on human capital, on the labor supply of increased heat. Also, the need to divert resources from technological innovation to reconstruction, for example. So all these could lead to permanent reduction in potential supply. Moving on to the transition risks. So we know that we've seen examples where climate policy can affect incentives to invest and consume. The question is climate policy the same? Can we treat climate policy exactly in the same ways as we treat other forms of fiscal policy? Or do we need other instruments? Do we need other models? I think this is a big question for central banks. Also, can asymmetric climate policy lead to distortion in trade patterns? On the supply side, again, mitigation and adaptation will require resources that will be diverted away from capital stock and technological innovation. And climate policy could also affect the supply of other inputs. So what does this mean for the analytical framework of monetary policy authorities? So to some extent, the central banks are already used to assessing the impact of weather on GDP, for example. So in the short term, the effect of snow days or particularly hot periods. But if we believe that, therefore, that these events are going to become more and more frequent, one extra hot day per year, every year, one additional hot day, then we really need to start, thinking about these effects more, strengthening our tools to think about these effects. So one possibility would be to include climate shock in DSG modeling. Kin and Paco have a very nice example where they have both destruction of capital and also a TFP shock in their model. So there is scope for introducing this kind of model, extending them. For example, countries like the UK, which aren't so vulnerable to physical risks from climate change, but the risks come from the openness of the economy, so through trade channels. So incorporating these other channels into DSG models is something that we could think about more. Also, we need empirical evidence on the effect of climate policy. So Martin and his colleagues at the Imperial College, for example, have done a study of the impact of the climate change levy in the UK on businesses, and they found that, for example, the levy didn't have an impact on employment or output or exit. So more of this kind of evidence is useful to calibrate our models. But there is a feeling that there is a need to rethink this kind of modeling for central banks. The approach of integrated assessment model is quite crude. The damage function is not sophisticated enough to model all these channels that we've seen. So new modeling technique, for example, agent-based models have been, for example, mentioned. So agent-based models are appealing because they simultaneously can help model complexities and also the heterogeneity of climate impacts. And they have been used in both in climate change modeling and in macroeconomic modeling and in financial stability. Therefore, there is a scope for bringing them together. And finally, let me say a few words about feedbacks and spillovers, which is a particularly relevant issue for central banks. So, for example, this chart shows how macroeconomic and financial climate shocks, transition shocks, can interact. So the blue boxes are real variables. The yellow-orange boxes are financial variables. The purple lines indicate spillover effects, transition effects. The red line indicate feedbacks. And so you can see how these real and financial variables interact, and you can easily have spillovers from financial variables back to real variables, and therefore aggregate demand and supply. And these kind of feedbacks are a real challenge for central banks because they affect all the areas of their responsibility. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Sandra. Our discussant is Warwick McKibben from the Australian National University.
Yeah, thank you very much, Glenn, and thank you to the San Francisco Fed for inviting me to come and discuss this paper. I agree with much of what the paper says, but I think there's quite a few issues that the paper doesn't address. So what the paper does is it reviews the links between through which climate risk can affect central banks' monetary policy objectives and policy responses. And Sandra gave a very clear exposition of the links there. And the second part of it, which is actually where I'll spend a fair bit of my discussion, is it discusses the approaches of incorporating climate change and climate policy into central bank models. I'll get to my comment in a second. So what doesn't the paper do? Where does it miss out? There's a very large literature out there outside of three equation models in central banks that actually model the impact of climate shocks on the economy. And I can't resist Jim McFarlane sitting in the audience, and he's done a lot of work on comparing these models and the climate change economics special issue from 2018 that he co-edited with Adele Morris sets out all the major macro climate type models under a standard set of scenarios looking at some of these issues. Particularly the focus was on carbon taxation and the different effects in different models. There are models out there that do have climate shocks and climate policies, and they have financial sectors and they have a large range of asset classes. So these models do exist, and I'll come to that in the second part of my discussion comments. So as I said, the paper does a good job looking at climate shocks and how you might respond to them. So as Sandra said, climate events reduce output, damage balance sheets of corporations, there's stability issues, financial fragility issues. There's an impact potentially on trend output growth. You could end up, if you wanted to think about it simply in a monetary framework, the old literature on optimal monetary policy, this is a supply shock more than a demand shock. If it's a supply shock, you may want to think inflation targeting isn't really the best idea. Maybe nominal income targeting, like we used to argue in the 90s before inflation targeting became popular. Maybe a nominal income targeting approach is better. And weather volatility could increase price volatility. There's a lot of issues here for central banks, and you really do need a model or a modelling framework to pick apart the key issues and how it affects the design of policies. Now, there are other issues that you didn't touch on, and there's a paper that Brookings brought out a few years ago with myself, Peter Wilcox and Adele Morris and Augustus Panton, who's a PhD student of mine sitting in the room. And some of the issues there were, it's not just that you get more volatility in inflation. If you look at any of the carbon tax literature, and again, Jim McFarlane's volume has all the models with the same result, carbon taxes will rise over time. So it's not just that there'll be more volatility, perhaps, if it's a cap and trade system with carbon pricing, but there will be a trend. So central banks in an inflation targeting world have to worry about understanding what the trend in the carbon price is, as well as what might be happening to potential output. Secondly, Augustus in his PhD thesis looks at when you get more volatility coming from climate change, does it break down your capacity to forecast potential output? Because in a world where you can't forecast potential output, the key driver of the inflation targeting framework is lost. And we already know from research over the last decade, the ability of central banks to forecast potential output and output gaps has broken down. And so there's an argument why you may actually want to think, well, if inflation targeting is my goal, how do I implement it when the existing way of implementing inflation targeting through output gaps breaks down? And Augustus, in his PhD thesis, adds climate variables to output gap modelling and finds that you can pick up a lot of the errors in the output gap by picking up the effects of climate. So there is an issue here about whether you may want to just change the framework completely. And the third point, I think, which is important, and I raise this, and that is if your inflation forecasts are breaking down, and the whole goal of policy is to tell the market what you think will be happening into inflation, and you get it wrong year after year after year, which is what we're seeing in many countries, do you really want to reconsider maybe some other forecasting framework like nominal income growth would be a better framework? Because it's an empirical question, can you forecast nominal GDP better than you can forecast inflation? And the answer is, on Australian data, the equivalent errors, if you look at root mean square percentage errors, nominal GDP forecasting is more accurate than inflation forecasting. So I think there's a big issue here, not just about how do central banks respond to shocks, but should they redesign the whole monetary framework? You can also turn it around and ask the question, well, if you care about central banks' responses, should you pick a particular climate framework to implement? So, for example, cap and trade leads to a fairly fixed amount of emissions year after year, but volatile carbon prices, whereas a carbon tax gives you volatile emissions, but a well forecastable forward path for carbon prices. So if you're thinking about the optimal joint choice of policies, in this paper we come down with the argument that you should probably think about nominal growth targeting and either a carbon tax or a hybrid type policy as the mixed optimisation, rather than thinking of the two policy frameworks as two independent choices. Now, the second half of the paper, and this is what I want to focus for the last few minutes, is what do central banks actually need? Like, do we just take, and Sandra pointed, you could take a DSG model, which I think is too small anyway, because it doesn't pick up relative price volatility, which is a big deal for the macroeconomy. Do you add a few bells and whistles? Or do you take a full integrated assessment model, which has all sorts of feedbacks and complexity? My view is you want neither of those. What you want to do is stand back and say you want a consistent macro framework, but you need sectoral disaggregation because climate shocks and climate policy change relative prices, and we've got a lot of mistakes by central banks by not understanding the role of relative prices. Secondly, you want a variety of financial assets, so you need a financial sector. No point having a real model with no financial sector if you're doing monetary policy. You need to worry about how energy is generated, how it's distributed, and who's using energy and which type of energy. So you need the full input-output structure in the macroeconomy. You need to worry about a global model because if you just focus on one country, what China does or what Europe does has a massive impact on everybody, not just Australia, not just New Zealand, but also the US. So if you're thinking holistically, you need a global framework. So there are models out there. I was going to spend the last few minutes just saying there is one called the G-cube model, which was published in the Handbook of Computable General Equilibrium Modelling. It's a reasonable publication. It's one of the North Holland handbooks. But it's not in the macro literature. It's in the energy, climate, environment literature, which everybody who is in the central banks should start reading if they're going to work in this area. So it's a well-documented model. It's used around the world, actually, for a whole range of issues. Companies use it for scenario planning. Governments use it for climate policy. There's a whole range of uses. It's a hybrid of a DSG-type model, which we see in central banks, but it has a lot of sectoral disaggregation. It captures inter-industry flows, cross-country flows of goods and capital, and has an intertemporal model of consumption and investment. Coming back to Ken's point, my view is this is a complex issue. We have the numerical techniques to solve complex models, and that's what the goal of this framework is. It's an annual model with sectoral dynamics. We have frictions in the labour market. We have adjustment costs in capital accumulation, and we have a range of stickiness that gives us the empirical regularities we observe. It's very similar to the theory models that have been presented. Firms are producing output, they're maximising their value. Households are maximising utility subject to wealth constraints and liquidity constraints. We have some agents with rational expectations, some without rational expectations. We have wage stickiness, we have rigidity, we have a role for central banks. And we have financial markets for bonds, equities and foreign exchange across all countries. And we have international trade of goods and services and financial assets. We have fiscal rules in each country. We have monetary rules in each country. So in summary then, it's an intertemporal framework where we have partly forward-looking, partly backward-looking behaviour. A lot of econometric estimation of the elasticities of substitution in production and consumption. That's important because they're key parameters for whether something is positive or negative. And we distinguish very importantly between financial capital and physical capital. Physical capital is locked in place in sectors and can only gradually be moved. Financial capital can flow instantaneously across sectors and across countries. Real models mess those two concepts up, and that's a fundamentally important issue for central banks. Give you one example before I finish. Version 20J, this is a version that was used by the Australian government to work out what would be the targets that Australia should take to the Paris Agreement. So we did the formal modelling using this model. We came up with a 26 to 28% target. There are 10 regions, so the whole world is divided into mostly emerging countries, actually. That's because that's where the issue is. It's not really what the US and Europe are doing and Japan. It's really what the Chinese, the Indians and the rest of the world will be doing. And again, a lot of sectoral disaggregation. Electric delivery sector, down the bottom here are the various technologies for creating electricity, coal, oil, gas, nuclear, etc. And then the linkages within the economy broken down between energy and non-energy use. And particularly, it's important to have transportation in there because transportation use of fossil fuels is very different to other uses of fossil fuels. You won't get leakage of transportation by Americans driving in Mexico when you put on a carbon tax. So there's a few key issues that need to worry about. I'm running out of time. It's very simply idea, there's a group of agents in each country, there's a group of markets, they all interact with each other at a point in time and looking into the future. And it's a very large model, 12,000 equations, 642 state variables, 230 co-state variables. We solved the model out to 2010. You need complexity to understand a complex question. And I won't go through all that policy applications. There are two that I want to stress. One is the IMF used this in Chapter 4 of the World Economic Outlook in 2008, looking at climate policy from a financial perspective. So it has been used for that. Another one I should mention, and there's a lot of these, the Australian government uses this extensively now for looking at real-world applications. There's an entirely large publication in the academic literature, but the applications by policymakers is widespread. It's just not in central banks. And anyone who's interested, the GQ website is up here. Let me just conclude by again saying that I think central banks need to worry about climate policy. They need to worry about climate change. And I think Sandra's exposition in her paper of some of the key issues I think are important, but I do worry about the joint determination of policy. Climate policy and monetary policy has to be considered together because both will change each other. And I think that's missing from the discussion. Thank you.